Hi guys, welcome to the seminar on CDSP obedience. Today it's just going to be a little bit of an overview of the organization, the competition format. My name is Tania Lex. I am a CDSP judge in Minnesota. I don't have any coolies myself, but I was hoping to join you guys at Coolie Nationals this year and give you an in-person seminar, in-person introduction to CDSP, and judge a competition for you guys. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, but hopefully through this webinar you can get a little bit of an introduction to the sport, and then you guys can have a whole year to train, and hopefully I'll get to see you next year. Like I said, my name is Tania Lex. I have Border Collies that I compete with. I have 2 right now that are competing. June is 12.5 and Ira is 6.5. And so you'll get to see both of them through the examples that I'm going to play for you in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. So today we're going to talk about obedience, and specifically CDSP obedience. I'm guessing some of you have at least some background in obedience or rally. That will probably be AKC for most of you, and some of you might not have any background in obedience at all. Maybe the sport is completely new to you. So we're going to talk just a little bit about what is obedience in general, what is tested, how is it scored, and then we're going to go through specifically what is CDSP obedience, what's unique about the venue, the specific exercises that are tested at each level in CDSP obedience. So what is obedience? It can probably best be summed up as precision teamwork exercises. So basically you and the dog are working together to complete precise tasks. Tasks include things like heeling, recalls, retrieves of various types, retrieves of dumbbells, retrieves of scent articles, retrieves of gloves, positions and stays. So changing positions between sit and stand, down, staying in position with various distractions, and scent work. And then as you get into the more advanced levels, things like sendaways and directed work. So you have 4 levels with increasing difficulty. You start in starter novice. It's an optional level. You can skip it if you want. It is a really great level for new handlers and new dogs. Moving into novice, open, and then utility is the highest level. So those are your 4 basic titles that you can get. And then there are advanced and championship titles that you can go on to get if you would like. So exercises are patterned, and the order of the exercise is predictable. So every time you step into the ring, you are going to know what you're doing. Your dog is going to know what you're doing. It's a little bit different than rally or agility in that way, where you kind of know what you're doing, you know which exercises, but you might not know the order or how they're going to be put together. Obedience is going to be the same every time until you get into the advanced or championship classes. And they still have the same exercises. They mix up the order a little bit, but you're definitely going to know what the order is before you walk into the ring. So titles are available at each level, and in order to receive a title you need 3 qualifying scores of a minimum of 170 points out of 200. At each level there are going to be certain faults in each exercise that can NQ you, certain things that regardless of your score it would be a non-qualifying fault. But for the most part we're just taking points off for minor faults as you go through the exercises, and qualifying as long as you meet the minimum standard of 170. So of all of the venues that you could compete in, why CDSP? I think for most people, if you've had any previous experiences with obedience, it's probably been AKC. And unfortunately, some people have had negative experiences with AKC, and obedience has developed a little bit of a relationship as being maybe stuffy, boring, maybe not as friendly of an environment as some other sports like disc or like updog. You're not going to find that in CDSP, and I don't want to say anything bad about AKC because I think it's a great venue, and I think for the most part, if you go to an AKC show, you're going to have a good experience, at least nowadays. But CDSP is a little bit different. It kind of draws a more of a positive training crowd. It's definitely going to be a positive, a friendly, a supportive environment. So a little bit more maybe like disc or some of those other sports in that respect. So one of the great things about CDSP is that you can have treats in the ring at every level of competition. Obedience is kind of a hard sport, maybe harder than some other sports like disc or agility or dock diving, because there are no inherent rewards in obedience, and some dogs are going to like it more than other dogs, but in the training process you're building up the enthusiasm for the sport with external motivators, with treats, with toys, and then you go into the ring in AKC and you can't bring that with you. And that can be very demotivating for dogs. So the nice thing about CDSP is you are allowed to use food. There are rules about when and how you can use it, obviously, so you can reward at the end of every exercise. You have to reward your dog in position, so when the judge calls exercise finished, before you move out of position and move to the next exercise, you're allowed to give your dog a food reward. You have to keep that in your pocket, not in a bait bag, and you have to avoid dropping that food on the ground. Obviously, we don't want treats on the floor in the ring. That would be distracting to other dogs. So dropping food is a pretty hefty 5-point penalty. So CDSP is great for new dogs, great for dogs who might have a little less confidence, because they do get to bring those external motivators into the ring with them. In addition to treats in the ring, you can praise in the ring, and that's something that you can't do in AKC for whatever reason. It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to me. We want to be praising our dogs. We want to be telling them that they're doing a good job. That's something that you can't bring into the ring in AKC, at least during exercises, but you can in CDSP. So during exercises, you can tell your dog they're doing a good job and give them that encouragement. You have to be careful that you're not cueing them multiple times, so that praise is actually telling them that they're doing a good job while they're doing a good job, and not using it to nag or to get them back after they've lost focus. But it's great when your dog is doing a good job in the ring to be able to tell them that. So in CDSP, every exercise has multiple pieces to it. For example, retrieve over a high jump, your dog has to go over the jump, take the dumbbell, come back over the jump, come into front position, and then return to heel position after giving you the dumbbell. In AKC, a lot of the exercises you can only use one cue. Your dog has to know what to do at each stage of the exercise. CDSP is a little bit different because you can cue every piece of an exercise. So for example, heeling. In AKC, all I can do is tell my dog heel at the beginning of the pattern, and then the dog has to automatically sit when I stop, and that kind of thing. And in CDSP, when I stop, I can cue that sit. When I do a recall, I can cue the front. So you have a little bit more leeway in CDSP to actually help your dog with additional cues at each piece of an exercise. You can also use hand signals and a verbal cue together for pretty much everything. Obviously, when you're in the utility, which is the highest level, and you're doing the signals exercise, you're not allowed to use verbals in addition to your signals, because the point of the exercise is that your dog is responding only to those hand signals. But for pretty much everything else, you can use a hand signal and a verbal together. Now, you can't use a hand signal and then when your dog doesn't respond to that hand signal, add a verbal. That would be a second cue. But you can use them together, which is a great source of support for the dogs. A lot of dogs will respond better getting both of those cues together than just getting one or the other. And you can use additional cues in the ring. So you can use additional cues almost anywhere for a point deduction. In AKC, the rules are a bit more strict on additional cueing. There are certain places that you can, but probably most places you can't use additional cues. In almost all the exercises in CDSP, there are a couple of exceptions, but if your dog doesn't perform on the first cue, you can give them a second cue, and it's a 3-point deduction. So if you're having to cue constantly, those 3 points add up really quickly, and you can NCue yourself just based on giving multiple cues to the dog. But it's nice that if your dog is momentarily distracted or is confused, didn't hear you for some reason, that's not going to be an NCue. That's not going to be enough to disqualify you. You can give them that extra cue to help them out. So one of the great things about CDSP, and something that's been great for me, I have more anxious dogs They're kind of nervous. My younger dog, especially when I first started working with him, he was really wary of being touched by strangers. And in AKC, your very first level, your starter novice level in AKC, involves the sit for exam, where the judge has to come up and touch the dog on the head. Your novice level involves the stand for exam, where the judge has to come up and touch the dog while they're standing on their head, shoulders, and rear end. And so the great thing about CDSP is the very first level in starter novice, there is no exercise where the judge is touching the dog. So you can kind of work on that, get in the ring, start competing with your dog while you're working through those things. Luckily, my dog was able to work through those fears, and while we were working on that, we were able to obtain our starter novice title. So it's really nice to be able to just get in the ring with a dog who's a little bit more anxious and doesn't like that much pressure being applied. There's less healing in CDSP than there is in AKC. So in AKC, you've got 2 healing patterns in the novice level, and there's only 1 in CDSP. So a lot of dogs find healing maybe boring, maybe demotivating, and having to do less of that in the ring helps keep their attention, helps make it more interesting for them. There are no group stays, and that's actually been changed in AKC recently, but in CDSP, you don't have to put your dog in a lineup with other dogs, which is something that I think has kept a lot of people away from obedience, has kept a lot of people away from AKC especially, is that when you have your dog in a lineup of stays with other dogs, you can control your dog's behavior, but you can't necessarily control the behavior of the other dogs around you. And for especially an anxious dog like the dogs that I have, if they were to have a bad experience with another dog getting up and approaching them, or worse, even attacking them in the ring, you might not ever get them back in the ring. And nobody really wants to put their dog in that kind of situation. It's really unfair to the dog, and that's completely avoided in CDSP. There are stay exercises, but they are individual exercises. Your dog is never going to be in the ring with another dog. One thing that's a little bit nice about CDSP is that jump heights are lower than they are in AKC, so there's not as much stress on your dog's body with the jumping involved in CDSP. And on top of that, exercise modifications are allowed for disabled dogs, older dogs, disabled handlers. As long as your dog is complying with the principal parts of the exercise, you're allowed to modify exercises. So that might mean lower jump heights, and it might mean other things. It's completely up to the judge whether that modification is acceptable. And so all you have to do is fill out a form prior to the show and submit it to the judge for that exception. So this is just a chart that kind of shows you the path through the various titling options. You can start in either starter novice or novice. It's entirely your choice. Like I mentioned a little earlier, starter novice is a really nice class for beginner dogs and beginner handlers. It's a short class. The exercises are all pretty short. So it's a really great place to start, and you need 3 qualifying scores at each level in order to go from starter novice to open and then to utility. And then at each level there are advanced and championship classes that you can take advantage of if you are interested. Your advanced starter novice title is 5 qualifying scores. Your novice championship and open championship are going to be 10 qualifying scores, and instead of getting a 170-point minimum to qualify at those advanced and championship levels, your qualifying score minimum moves up to 185 points. Okay, so now I want to go over the individual exercises that are involved in each class. I'm just going to kind of start with reviewing the names of the exercises, just in general what they are, and then we're going to go through video examples of each exercise, talk a little bit about what are the non-qualifying faults, what is the judge looking for in the scoring of the exercise, and see video of each exercise. So in starter novice we have 5 exercises. We have healing on leash, a figure 8 healing also on leash, and an on-leash stand with distraction. So the large majority of this class is going to be performed on leash, and then off leash you'll have a half ring recall and a half ring sit stay. Okay, so let's take a look at a starter novice run. This is me and my little guy Ira. This is his 3rd leg for his starter novice title. And the first exercise that we're going to see is the heel on leash. So we'll talk a little bit more after we look at the exercise about what is heeling and what the judge is looking for in this exercise. Essentially, the judge is going to call a pattern that's always going to involve at least one left turn, one right turn, one about turn, so that's a 180, and changes of pace, so you'll do a fast pace and a slow pace, and at least one halt during the pattern and one at the end. So let's take a look.
Forward, heel, left turn, dash, about turn, halt, forward, right turn, slow, double, about turn, halt.
So that was our on-leash heeling exercise. The essence of heeling, what the judge is looking for, is that the dog and the handler are moving together as a team. The dog is attentive to the handler, paying attention to turns, to pace changes. So let's take a look at non-qualifying faults, things that are going to be an NQ on the heeling exercise. There are not very many. Consistently tight leash is going to be one. So if the leash is consistently tight, that means the dog isn't paying attention to the handler. So teamwork isn't being demonstrated in that exercise. What does consistently mean? That's going to vary depending on the judge. If I'm the judge, I'm probably looking at 50% or more of the time that the leash is tight. That would be a non-qualifying run. If the handler is consistently adapting to the dog's pace, again, the dog is supposed to be paying attention to where the handler is going. So if your dog is just kind of creeping along in the ring and you slow down so that you stay in heel position with the dog, that's going to be an NQ if that's happening consistently. And then failure to change pace, if the judge calls a fast pace or a slow pace and you don't change pace, that would be an NQ as well. So everything else is just points in heeling, and when we're talking about heeling points off, we're talking about generally positional errors. We want the dog to stay in as tight a heel position as possible in order to get up the maximum score. So if you're familiar with these words, positional errors, wide means drifting away from the handler. Crowding would be touching the handler. We don't want the dog crowding or tripping or running into the handler. Forging is the dog is ahead of the handler, lagging the dog is behind. Crabbing means the dog's butt is swinging out or swinging in behind the handler. And then wrapping is the dog actually curving around the handler's body. So we don't want to see any of those. We want the dog to just kind of stay in a nice position, working together with the handler and not getting in the way. And then the other thing that can cause points off in heeling is sits. And you're going to see this with every single exercise. Almost every exercise involves a sit at some point, whether that's a sit in heel position or a sit in front. We want sits to be straight, so we want the dog to be lined up with the handler, and we want them to be quick. So if the dog is taking a long time to decide to sit, that is probably going to result in points off. So how many points off is going to depend on the severity of the error, and that's going to kind of vary from judge to judge. If it's a small error, 0.5 point to 1 point points off are pretty normal. If the dog is, for example, consistently wide, consistently out of position, but just generally, generally paying attention, but not necessarily staying in a great heel position, you're still going to probably qualify in that exercise, but you might have 5 to 10 points off depending on how many errors and how consistently those errors are happening. So the next exercise we're going to take a look at is the on-leash figure 8. So this is another heeling exercise. You're going to have two stewards come into the ring and they'll stand facing each other about 8 feet apart. And the handler and the dog will heel around the stewards in a figure 8. You'll make 2 figure 8s. And the judge will sit you halfway through and then sit you at the end. was your figure 8 healing exercise. The exercise is obviously very similar to your regular healing pattern. Things that make your figure 8 more challenging are the fact that you have stewards, obviously, so that's a potential distraction for the dog, and also the changes of pace that the dog has to make. So as you're doing your figure 8 healing exercise, the handler wants to kind of maintain the same walking pace throughout the exercise, but as the dog is going through the outside turn, they're going to have to speed up to maintain their position next to the handler, and as they're going through the inside turn, they're going to need to slow down to maintain that position. And then that sit through the middle is a place where it's really easy for the dog to get out of position on the sit. So unique challenges with the figure 8 healing exercise. You notice that Ira and I started off to the right. You can go in either direction to start the exercise. Non-qualifying faults for your figure 8 healing are going to be very similar to your healing exercise. Tight leash, adapting to the dog's pace. There are no pace changes in figure 8 healing, so failure to change pace wouldn't be a non-qualifying fault here. That's an error on the slide. As far as points, similar, again, positional errors, slow and crooked sits. Sniffing stewards, you saw that caught Ira a little bit on that one. That would probably be a point or two deduction for sniffing the steward on that exercise. He got it the second time around. So the next exercise is the on-leash stand with distraction. This is really a stay exercise, so it's going to be a stand stay. I'm going to cue Ira to stand, walk to the end of the leash, turn and face him, and then he has to remain in position while the judge walks around him. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's no exercise in the starter novice level where the judge touches the dog, so rather than coming up and touch his body, it'll just be making a circle around him in this exercise. So what the judge is looking for in this exercise, non-qualifying faults would be breaking the stand. It is a stay exercise, so your dog needs to stay in that stand position. So going to the handler, moving any significant distance, that's going to be an NQ. Minor foot movement, so if the dog is just moving a little bit, that's just going to be points off. But if the dog moves significantly, that would be a non-qualifying score. Obviously, any aggression at any point during the run, any aggression towards the judge would be an NQ. As we talked about a little bit earlier, multiple cues are okay, so you can tell your dog to stay more than once, but you cannot hold that hand signal the entire time the judge is walking around in order to be a constant reminder to the dog that they need to be staying in place. And then the dog has to respond to your stand cue. You can use a hand signal, you can use a verbal, you can use both. You cannot physically assist the dog into the stand. So if you're familiar with AKC, AKC does not require the dog to respond to the cue. The handler can actually put the dog in a stand position. You can't do that in CDSP, but once your dog is standing, you can stack them. So if you've got a confirmation dog and they're used to that, you can put their feet in the position where you want them to stay. So the last two exercises for the class are going to be performed off leash. So the first one is going to be a recall exercise. There's a chair positioned at the front of the ring. I'm going to take Ira to set up in front of that chair. I'm going to take his leash off, set up in heel position. At the judge's cue, I'm going to walk to the middle of the ring, and on her cue, I'm going to call him to front position, and then to finish. So for the recall, the idea is that the dog stays in position until called, and then after being called, comes directly to the handler. So non-qualifying faults would be anticipation, meaning the dog doesn't stay until called, anticipates that recall cue, and failure to go directly to the handler. So if the dog's wandering all over the ring before coming to the handler, that would be an NQ. Things that are points off would be standing prior to being called. So obviously you're leaving the dog in a sit position. If they just stand but they don't anticipate that recall, that's just going to be points off. Failure to sit in front or in finished position. So again, I mentioned a little bit earlier, sits are a big deal in obedience. If the dog comes to front and doesn't sit, that's going to be a 5-point deduction. Crooked sits or slow sits are just going to be a lower number of points, 0.5 point, 1 point, 2 points if it's really off. So those sits are important. Sitting in front position, obviously we want the dog to be very close to the handler. We want the dog to be squared up to the handler, but not so close that they're touching or sitting between your feet. And then on that sit in heel position, the finish, same thing. If they don't sit at all, that's a 5-point deduction. If their sit is just less than perfect, that's going to be points off. Your final exercise for your starter novice run is going to be the stay. So I left the leash on the chair prior to the recall exercise. What I'm going to do in this exercise is on the judge's cue, leave Ira in a sit stay, go get the leash, and return back to heel position. And that's the end of the starter novice run. So with that sit stay, obviously it's a stay, which means exactly what it sounds like, moving a substantial distance or changing positions from a sit to a down would be an NQ. More than 3 cues to stay would NQ you. So I mentioned earlier you can use multiple cues. You can remind your dog what they're supposed to be doing with the stays. If you use more than 3 cues, that's an NQ. Points on this would be minor movement, so just shuffling positions, shuffling forward a little bit would be points off, whining and barking. Fairly simple exercise as long as they're staying where you leave them. That's going to be a qualifying exercise. So moving on to the novice level, novice is going to be very similar. We get a little bit more fun for the dog. We have a recall over a bar jump. The exercise is going to start with an on-leash heeling exercise, and then the rest of the class is going to be off-leash. So you have your figure 8 that you'll perform in the exact same way, except that it will be off-leash. You have an off-leash moving stand for exam, so now we're getting into the classes where the judge will actually be touching the dog. Your recall is going to be over a jump, and you're going to have a longer stay exercise that's going to be either a sit or a down at the handler's choice. So we're going to take a look at a novice run by my other border collie, June, my older dog. I'm going to just kind of play the heeling and the figure 8 together. I won't comment on those. The scoring is going to be the same as it would be for the starter novice exercise. So I'll just play those so you can see what they look like, and then we'll start up with some more commentary for the moving stand for exam. was your on-leash heeling and your off-leash figure 8 heeling. Very, very similar to your starter novice level. The heeling, you probably saw there was a person in the ring initially walking by, and so that's one distinguishing feature of the novice level, is that you'll have what's called a distraction steward in the ring on that first leg of heeling. So the person will just simply walk in a straight line out of the ring, and obviously the dog is supposed to ignore that distraction. That's something that if that causes them to move out of position, that would be points off. So this is going to be your moving stand for exam exercise. Scoring is very similar to your stand with distraction that we saw in the starter novice exercise, but the actual exercise for the dog is a bit more complex. You're going to heel into the stand. So you'll have your dog set up in heel position. The judge will cue forward just like in the heeling exercises. And the judge will cue you to stand your dog. So the idea is that the dog stops in a stand position without sitting first. They do sit first, that's not an NQ, that's just points off. So you want to stop, stand your dog, and then the judge will cue you to leave your dog. You'll walk forward and face the dog just like you did in the starter novice exercise with the stand with distraction. And then the judge will walk by and touch the dog lightly on the side, so it's just a hand down the rib cage, and then back to your dog. We'll go right into the recall over the bar jump. So you're going to set up on one side of the jump. This is a minimum 16-foot recall. You have to be at least 8 feet behind the jump when you set up, and the recall has to go 8 feet past the jump. You can set up farther than that. So if you have a fast dog, if you have a dog that's going to need more time to collect to come into front position, you definitely are allowed to set up at a greater distance, but 8 feet is going to be your minimum. Again, it's a stay exercise. To some extent, you have to leave your dog in a sit and then call them over the jump on the judge's cue. The dog comes into front position, and then on the judge's cue finishes into heel position. So I'll just pause there. A quick note, you can see me leading June by the collar. That is allowed in the starter novice and novice levels, to take your dog gently by the collar and lead them around the ring. Part of the reason I'm doing that with June is because she is deaf, so if she does wander away from me, it's a little bit harder to get her attention back. So scoring for your recall over the bar jump is going to be very similar to your recall in starter novice. Non-qualifying faults would be anticipation. Because we have the jump, it's a little bit different, so a lot of the non-qualifying faults have to do with the jump. So if the dog doesn't take the jump, if they go around, if they vault off the bar, or if they knock the bar off the jump, those would be non-qualifying scores. Touching the bar, if they just tick it with the toenail, that's going to be just points off. And then your sits in front and finish, the crooked and the slow, are obviously points as always. So the last exercise for your novice is going to be a stay exercise. You're going to be in the middle of the ring. The judge will ask you before the stay exercise if you plan to do a sit or a down. It's entirely your choice as the handler. Just pick the one that you think your dog is most likely to stay in. So with the stay exercise, what you're going to see is you're going to leave your dog in a stay in the middle of the ring. You're going to walk all the way around the ring and then return back to the dog. It's not the most exciting thing to watch, but it's good to have an idea of what that looks like. So we'll play that for you.
Nice job.
So with that stay exercise, again, scoring is pretty self-evident. It's a stay exercise, so the dog has to stay in position. If you choose a down, the dog has to down on the first cue. You can give an additional cue, but it's a 3-point deduction. So the idea is that the dog changes position on the handler's cue and then remains in that position for the entire exercise. Alright, so the open class is where things start to get really fun. There's a little bit of healing, but most of the exercises involve jumps, involve dumbbells. Things are a little bit more inherently rewarding for the dog. It's going to start with an off-leash healing pattern, so the entire class in open will be off-leash. Then you'll have a running broad jump, drop on recall, retrieve on the flat, retrieve over a high jump, and then a go out, turn, and sit. So we're going to go back to Ira. We're going to take a look at one of Ira's open runs. So since for a lot of you this is maybe a new sport, something that you're just thinking about trying out, not necessarily thinking about getting to the highest levels, but just getting that starter novice or novice title at the very least, I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over the specifics of the open and utility exercises, but I do want to show you these levels just because this is where this starts to get really fun for the dog and for the handler. And there tends to be more variety in the exercises. So I'm just going to go over the basics. I want to show you the runs. I want to give you a taste of what comes up in the higher levels. So we're going to start with the off-leash healing exercise.
Are you ready?
Forward. About turn. Halt. Forward. Right turn. Fast. Normal. Left turn. About turn. Slow. Normal. Right turn. Halt. Exercise finished.
So your healing pattern is always going to end in front of your broad jump and open, since that's your next exercise. And if you're familiar with AKC obedience, this is going to look a little bit different from the AKC exercise. In CDSP, the handler and dog are going to start healing towards the jump and then run by the jump, and then the handler will call the dog to front position. There have actually been some modifications to the exercise since this video was taken, but it's pretty similar, so it'll give you a good taste of what the exercise should look like.
Ready. Forward. Over.
So non-qualifying faults on the running broad jump would basically be not taking the jump or stepping on the jump, which tends to happen because it's such a low jump. Sometimes dogs will just walk right over it. But for the most part, jump-related faults are going to be your NQs here, and the rest is just going to be points. So this is your recall exercise in open. It's a drop-on recall. You're going to leave the dog at one end of the ring. On the judge's cue, you're going to call the dog to you, and about halfway down the ring, the judge will give you a cue to drop your dog, so to cue your dog to go into a down. The dog has to down on the first cue, and then the judge will cue you to call the dog the rest of the way to you, and it's just a regular recall from there. So calling the dog to front position, and then finish on the judge's cue.
Out of here. Roll. Just. Finish. Get in. Exercise finished.
The next two exercises are going to be the retrieve exercises. So retrieve on the flat is just a straight retrieve. You can see the steward is going to come into the ring and bring me the dumbbell. The dumbbell has to go at least 20 feet on the throw. So it'll be a minimum 20-foot retrieve. And then we'll go right into the retrieve over the high jump. So you can see the high jump. It's not all that high. It's only a 16-inch jump for Ira, and jump heights are determined by the dog's height at the shoulder. There's a chart in the rules that would tell you what height your dog would be jumping, and like we said, modifications are available for older dogs, dogs with disabilities. There's one Golden who competes locally who jumps only 4 inches, but he's still fulfilling the principal pieces of the exercise, so that's allowed in CDSP. So we'll take a look at the retrieve exercises. I'll just play those back to back. The dog obviously has to go retrieve the dumbbell, bring it back, sit in front position, hold the dumbbell until the handler takes it, and then finish on the judge's cue.
Send your dog.
Take it.
Take it.
Finish.
Exercise finished. Hi, John. Are you ready?
Ready.
Throw. Send your dog.
Take it. Over. Turn.
Take it.
Finish. Take it.
Exercise finished. Good boy.
So where the video cut out there initially, if you're concerned about your throwing, which I think probably most of the coolie people watching this are disc people, so maybe throwing is not a concern for you, but I threw the dumbbell out of the ring about 4 times prior to that first retrieve exercise, so we cut those out of the video. But throwing the dumbbell out of the ring is not a problem. You just pick it up, try again. Over the jump, if the dumbbell bounces too far to one side or the other, the judge will take pity on you and give you a rethrow. But the dog does have to go over the jump on the way to retrieve the dumbbell and come back over the jump. And in CDSP, those extra cues come in handy. You can just give the dog a reminder to come back over the jump and then a reminder to come into front. So the last exercise for the CDSP open run is a go out, turn, and sit. And I switched to a different run. So Ira did perform in the last run the go out, turn, and sit in a qualifying way, but not in a good way. So I want to give you guys an example of what the exercise is actually supposed to look like. And so we'll take a look at a different run. This is one of his other open runs. The go out and turn and sit is in open unique to CDSP. There is no go out in AKC until the utility level. So it's a half ring. You set up in front of the wall, facing a wall. Usually you'll have stanchions, so you can see on this wall we have uprights, and normally those can kind of serve as a target for the dog. You don't necessarily have those. It does help. Most people will train their dog to go to a stanchion, but I have been in situations where you have to send your dog to a blank wall, and that's obviously a little bit harder for the dog. If you have a wall that has a lot of stuff on it, like if you were sending to this wall, that can be a little bit harder. So this is one of the more complex exercises to train, and with Ira, I had a lot of trouble because he tends to be a bit of a Velcro dog, but in the end, this has ended up being one of his favorite exercises to do. So on the judge's cue, you're going to send the dog to run straight out away from you, and then on your own, you stop the dog with a sit cue. And the idea is you stop the dog in a 6 foot by 6 foot imaginary box that is at the end of the wall. The dog should be running straight out away from you. They should turn and sit on your cue. So sometimes you'll see dogs that have been trained to go to the stanchion will touch the stanchion and then turn around and sit. And that is qualifying, but it will be points off. They should be sitting on the handler's cue. and turning towards the handler. They don't have to turn and sit squarely, so it's not like a front where they have to be sitting straight and directly lined up with the handler, but just sitting and generally facing the handler on that exercise. And then on the judge's cue, the handler will simply return to heel position. So what we do want to see is the handler going around behind the dog to heel position on this exercise. Ira ended up sitting too close to the fence, so I decided to take a 3-point deduction and just pivot into heel position there. So on the slides I did break out the things that would be non-qualifying or points off for the open exercises. I'm not going to go through those in detail on this presentation. Go ahead and take a look at the PowerPoint if you're interested in more details on those exercises. Or definitely take a look at the rules. I've linked the complete CDSP rules in the at the end of the PowerPoint. You'll also have links to the videos that I played today, so you can take a look at those again. CDSP and obedience in general is a very rules-driven sport, so it's very important that you thoroughly read the rules. Make sure you know exactly what you're going to be scored on. Kind of the nice thing about obedience is, while it does require precision, you can kind of set your own criteria. So what's important to you? Do you want that 199? Do you want that perfect score? Is that what you're chasing? Or do you just want a qualifying score? Something else to do with your dog? Another opportunity to build that bond between you and your dog, do something fun together, but not quite as concerned about the precision. So just maybe not training to as tight of criteria as somebody who is looking for that perfect score, and that's completely fine, right? It's your game, it's your sport. You can make it what you want it to be, and but it is very important to know, you know, if you're going to maybe let something go, like the straightness on the sits, that what is going to be a non-qualifying score, what are the things that you absolutely have to have in your run versus what are the things that just might be points off. So go ahead and take a look if you're interested in the different criteria for the open exercises. I'm just going to run through utility, which is the highest level. I'm going to show a video of a different dog and handler in the utility level. My dogs haven't quite gotten there yet. So the signals exercise is going to involve a short heeling pattern and then position changes with only hand signals. So no verbals are going to be used in the signals exercise. Scent discrimination, so that's kind of fun. That's the first place that this comes into the obedience exercises. You're going to send the dog to a pile of articles, and then you're going to have to choose the one that you scented, so the one that has your scent on it, and bring that article back to you. Directed jumping, so the go out that we just saw in the open exercises, you're going to have a full ring go out. So you're going to send your dog out to the end of the ring. They're going to have to turn and sit, and then you direct them over either a jump on the left or a jump on the right. And then the directed retrieve exercise, they're going to be retrieving gloves. You'll have 3 gloves set up at the end of the ring, and they'll have to choose the one that the judge indicates and bring that article back to you. The moving stand for exam is similar to what we saw in the novice exercises, where you're moving from a heel position into a stand, except that you don't stop with the dog has to stop as you continue forward, and then the judge will touch them in a little bit more invasive way, not quite what you would see in AKC, but instead of just a quick brush down the side, the judge is touching the dog's head, shoulders, and rear end. And then instead of returning to your dog, it involves a recall, not to front position, but to heel position. So switching it up on the dog a little bit. Okay, so this is a utility run. My dogs have not competed in utility yet. So I'm going to show you a run by my instructor, Patty, and her corgi, Archer. This is actually a non-qualifying run, so Archer will make a mistake at some point during this run. I'm not sure where that will be. I'm just going to play the run as a whole and kind of narrate over it. So the first exercise is going to be the signals exercise. It's going to heel forward. It's going to be an about turn, so it's just a short heeling pattern. This is position changes on a signal only. You may not use verbals on this exercise. Okay, and that's the end of the exercise. It looks like that was a qualifying exercise. The next thing that they're going to do is scent discrimination. The steward is going to put out 4 articles. So Patty is scenting the article that Archer is supposed to find. She's going to give it to the judge. The judge is going to place it in the pile. And then Patty will send Archer to detect and retrieve that article.
Sit your dog.
Once the dog has found the correct article, it's just a normal retrieve. They have to bring it to front, hold it until the handler is cued to take it, and then finish. And another qualifying exercise.
So the next exercises are directed jumping. You just have to move on to that, I guess. Alright, so let me tell you to send
So
your
this
dog.
is going to be the directed jumping exercise.
Ready, send your dog. Sit.
So a go out just like an open, but a longer go out. The judge indicates which jump the dog should take. The handler has to direct the dog over that jump. And then the exercise is repeated with the opposite jump.
Over. Front. Now you do this. She has nothing. You're going to come into the center, or you're going to turn it to the
Okay, the next exercise will be the gloves exercise. This is repeated 2 times, so you can see the steward is putting the gloves out. There's 3 gloves, one at either end and one in the middle. And you don't know which glove you're going to be asked to take before you get into the ring. The judge will instruct you which glove to pivot to. And that's where Archer end cued. So you can see that Patty cued him to the glove on the right. He wanted to go to the middle. She called him off so that he couldn't self-reward with that glove. So even though he end cued, the run is going to continue. We're going to do the second part of the gloves exercise. And he found the right one that time. Okay, the last exercise is going to be the moving stand for exam. So you'll see it's similar to the novice stand for exam. Heeling into that stand, and the handler does not stop in this exercise. And then calling the dog directly to heel. So this is the only exercise where you call the dog to heel instead of to front. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope if you have been training obedience, this gives you a little bit more guidance as far as what the requirements are in CDSP, what the judge is looking for, the specific exercises that will be tested. I hope that if you have never competed in obedience before, that this has piqued your interest and you're excited and ready to start training. As I mentioned, I have included links to the CDSP rules at the back of the presentation, as well as links to all the videos that we watched today so that you can take another look at those if you're interested in doing so. If you have questions, I hope you join me for the live question and answer session, and if for whatever reason you can't make it to that, I am more than happy to answer questions if you send me questions by email, or if you find me on Facebook, send me a message through Messenger. I love talking to people about obedience, so I'm more than happy to answer your questions, point you in the right direction, and help you out in any way I can. Thanks!